All right, folks, we are live. Thanks everybody for joining for, I think this is the eighth episode of the Neurosurgery Journey. So we kicked off our journey here on the live stream podcast at the beginning of this year, 2023. We've had some great guests talk about their professional development experiences in neurosurgery. Last week we were fortunate to have Dr. Christian Bowers from New Mexico on to talk about kind of reinventing a program and the process of neurosurgery training. And now we're going to, have a conversation that's really near and dear to my colleague Divine and myself, because we're both MD PhD candidates and we're aspiring, neurosurgeon scientists, and we're joined by really phenomenal neurosurgeon scientist, Dr. Manish Aghi from the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Aghi is a neurosurgical oncologist and a cancer biologist. He's a professor in the neurological surgery department at UCSF. He earned his BS and MS at Stanford University. He then went on to a little place called Harvard Medical School to earn his MD and his PhD in neuroscience in their medical scientist training program. So we're really fortunate to have one of the preeminent neurosurgeon scientists on to talk about being a neurosurgeon scientist and what that training pathway is like. So, Dr. Aghi, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And this is definitely a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So,
absolutely. So just to kind of kick this off, so the name of the show is the Neurosurgery Journey, and we like to just explore what the pathway is like for different individuals as they're pursuing their neurosurgical careers. So can you tell us a little bit about your own path into neurosurgery, what the training looked like, when you knew you wanted to be a neurosurgeon scientist or at least a physician scientist, and then a little bit about how your pathway differs from somebody who goes straight through medical school and into neurosurgical training?
Yeah, great question. So for me, when I was, if I could, I would probably go all the way back to college. I sort of had an interest in science, but I also knew I wanted to be a physician, and physician scientist seemed like a way to accomplish all that. So I applied to MD PhD programs, but I think one of the things that I realized early on was a little different than it did feel like even back then and even now. Most of my colleagues who were in MD PhD training were essentially going on to become pure scientists without really much of a clinical presence or even a translational component to their research. And I really found that odd. I mean, I understood that it would be difficult to achieve this sort of coveted 50-50 split because of the work that goes into both jobs. But, the times when I was doing pure research, even as a trainee or as a student, I felt something missing, which was the patient experience, which is what we all love, whether we're neurosurgeons or even non-surgeons. At the same time, the times when I was buried in patient encounters, I found myself missing, part of my brain that thinks about research. And so I really early on, wanted to be an MD PhD who did both. And that kind of made me feel a little different. And so when I was looking, so then in Boston, when I was looking for labs to rotate in, my classmates who were MD PhDs were just going into these like hardcore basic science labs. And I kept looking for a lab that identified itself based on a disease. And, I was interested in the brain. So my first rotation lab was in an Alzheimer's disease lab, but it just didn't excite me. It felt like it just wasn't satisfying. I had this sort of rapid need for fulfillment that you don't get as a neurologist seeing dementia. And the lab component was similarly didn't fulfill that need. And so then my second lab was a brain tumor lab. And there were a number of neurosurgeons who were rotating their residents and things like that. And the environment was just spectacular. I found myself so energized to go back to work, to go in every day into the lab. And I knew I had found not just the place where I was going to do my PhD, but thankfully the disease I would study for the rest of my life. And meeting those folks who were neurosurgeons got me really thinking about neurosurgery for the first time. And so even though I had this long PhD ahead of me, I do remember going to the operating room with one of those residents who was taking out a brain tumor, and probably an operation that now would take 3 hours, back then with the technology was like almost 8 hours of surgery. But I just remember standing on my feet and staring at this operation and not like moving or dozing off or like being inattentive. And whereas if I shadowed a neurologist in clinic, it just felt like my mind would always drift to something else, like what I was having for dinner that night or something like that. And I tell people that I train, like, that's really what you're looking for. It's that primitive sense of like, oh my God, this is a place, this captures my attention in a way that nothing else does. And especially for me, like, I tend to drift very easily if I'm bored, and that just wasn't the case. So I kind of put that in my back pocket. I mean, I was leaving the clinic to go to grad school at the time, but I was like, this neurosurgery thing is something cool. And when I'm done with my PhD, it's something I want to explore deeper. So I finished the PhD, and then when I got to rotations, I wanted to be thorough and open-minded, so I looked at everything. But in the end, neurosurgery was the choice I made, and I was fortunate early on to identify mentors who were surgeon scientists in neurosurgery, and so although it seemed clear that the road would be challenging, it seemed doable, and so I sort of stuck with it, and it just kept kept checking all the boxes with each step.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think, hitting on that mentorship, that's something we've heard quite a bit about on the past couple episodes that we've had. I think neurosurgery, we talk all the time about it being this small field. I almost think that facilitates the mentorship because, everybody sort of has a vested interest in making sure that the people joining neurosurgery are, well trained and well kind of counseled on what that career is like. Which is really interesting. And it's great to hear that you had those experiences with surgeon scientists. So I want to loop back to, a question that's, a lot of MD PhD students face, or, really any student that maybe wants to take a year in the lab, and what should they be looking for in that lab? So it sounds like for you, maybe you weren't driven so much by what the pathology specifically was, but there might have been another element, at least that it did have clinical relevance. So can you talk a little bit about what that process was like for you?
Yeah, so it for me, the science needed to have the potential for a translational component, but it also needed to be real science and real the kind of science that any scientist would respect and applaud. And then the other thing is the environment. So I mean, obviously I mentioned mentorship, but I didn't want to be in a place. I mean, I think as neurosurgeons, we're all wound a little tight, but to me, an environment that you know that sort of calms things down and makes things warm and friendly and positive is helpful. And just a collegiality, like, working with people that, I would go out for a drink with after work, not just people that I say bye to when I leave for the day. And those things were important. Working with people that I would, trust and respect and consider myself friends with and really make lifelong friendships with. Those were all important things for my research environment, both as a trainee and then eventually as a PI myself.
Awesome. Divine, feel free to, jump in here with any questions that you might have as well.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Dr. Aghi. I just had a question too, just to, if you could, tell the audience a little bit, like, what is, when we talk about the 60-40 or the 50-50 balance in the MD PhD or the physician scientist life, what is your typical day like? How do you typically handle a week, and how do you balance those two different dichotomies?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it does tend to work out to be close to 50-50. But, obviously it's not more than the number. It's just knowing in your heart that you're giving enough attention to both aspects of your life. And so, on paper, my sort of schedule during the week is that I'm in the lab Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then Thursday in clinic all day. Friday is an OR day, but I do run 2 rooms concurrently, which is a subject of ongoing debate and discussion in the field. But having that as my default allows, more surgeries to get done, and is very helpful. My lab is, a separate campus from the clinical practice, so I tend to, as much as possible, avoid splitting days where I have to go back and forth. But as your surgical reputation grows, the demand for your services will grow as a surgeon. So I certainly am doing plenty of surgeries on Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and if that's the case, I try to, at least, make those surgical days a little shorter so I can get to the lab for a little bit on those days. And so, in theory, it sort of does work out pretty evenly split, but each week is its own entity. And the way I tend to do it is it's kind of like balancing your budget. Like you may stretch yourself a little thin one week with too much research or too much clinic, but as long as you're sort of steering yourself back to the center whenever possible, that usually does the trick.
Yeah, that's a great question. I almost found, I found it intimidating when we talk in the MD PhD program about like what the split should be, because I think a lot of traditional physician scientists talk about it more in the time perspective than maybe the attention perspective that you discussed. So the time in lab versus the time in clinic. So it's nice to hear that it does break down that way. It's just sort of in a different way. A question I've had, and I remember this when I was kind of on the MD PhD interview trail, is there were definitely some programs that seem to, be more receptive to the idea of training surgeon scientists, whereas there were others that, sort of like you talked about, really wanted, almost the clinician that was just going to become a scientist and had the MD by their name for, maybe prestige or for, a clinical tie. How do you, advise maybe MD PhD or future MD PhD students to try to discern that out, whether or not they will be fostered into, a true clinical career if that's something that they want?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's having interfaced with a number of administrative components of MD PhD programs. I think you'll certainly have access to information regarding, where their graduates end up, and that's all going to be pretty well documented. My experience is that it's what's more helpful, rather than sort of contacting the administrators, because MD PhD programs are so large. So what I did in my case, which was so long ago, is I identified a few recent graduates of the program who were pursuing surgical careers, or in my case, that there was one who was pursuing a neurosurgical career, and I reached out to them and just asked, were there any barriers they encountered during the graduate school portion of the training, or even the MD portion of the training, that it would help for me to know about ahead of time, and also just any resources or shortcuts they were able to create or take advantage of that could be helpful, including around the time of return to the wards, because that's, each school has its own sort of unique programs where individual departments can, so for example, we have a 2-week clerkship that is offered for third-year students, but has also been very helpful for returning PhD students to take before they jump into fourth year. And so little tricks like that, like something that's not advertised specifically for the MD PhD program, and probably the MD PhDs are just unaware of it, but a few years ago, somebody who was going into neurosurgery stumbled upon it, and it proved very helpful. So I think those sort of contacting individual examples is probably the most helpful. But yeah, certainly if you're looking at an MD PhD program as a prospective applicant, and there's just no precedent for someone going into a surgical field, that might be a bit concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. Divine, maybe we'll lean on a little bit of kind of peer advice here, since you're an M4 and you're just coming to the end of the MD PhD program. How did you go about, that transition from the PhD back to M3, knowing that you were interested in neurosurgery?
Yeah, actually, this is a question I was going to ask Dr. Aghi too, because when I look at the the MD PhD model, it seems very disjointed in the sense that you have the first 2 years of medical school where you sort of focus on the clinical aspect, and then you step out for a few years to do the PhD and sort of neglect that the clinical aspect a little bit, and then you go back into the third year with that same focus. I wanted to get your thoughts on that model in general, Dr. Aghi, and what would be moving forward to getting people more interested to make it more of a synergistic model where both are sort of complementing each other rather than being so disjointed. I don't know if you have any thoughts or ideas on if that model could be better, because I feel like it's contributing to a lot of MD PhD students that typically either have to feel like they have to choose one or the other at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can see sort of the argument for the status quo as well as the argument for some sort of revisions. I mean, I think the argument for the status quo that I always was sort of making to myself or to my trainees is that, during your career, almost certainly you're never going to have like, oh, I'm doing research this year and next year I'm doing clinical. It's you wear both hats every second of every day. But and so that's the argument for, well, if you have to do it for your career, why not start early? But the counter argument is training is a very unique period of time, and the only way to get really good at something is to do it exclusively, even if that means toggling back and forth in this sort of abrupt way. I think the same thing applies to residencies that have protected research time. You know, I had 2 years of protected research time in residency. In the first year, I had to cover some, call on the clinical service, and the second year I didn't. There's no doubt that I got more research done when I didn't have to cover all that call. And so I think there's a pretty compelling argument for having undivided attention. I mean, even when I first started as an attending and I had to write like my first R1s or whatever, I remember like shutting down my practice and just telling the office I'm on vacation this week. And I wasn't on vacation. I was just in the library or in the lab writing grants. And I think after that, I kind of got the hang of like juggling both. But early on, it can help to like, and there's probably like almost a neurophysiologic or cognitive argument for how learning works versus how, like, once you've learned and those synapses are there and like, how to write a basic science paper or how to, analyze single cell seq, then you can, lightly touch on those synapses and go back and forth. But while you're still developing your skill set, it might be beneficial to do just one. So I can sort of see it both ways. But
yeah, and going back to Michael's question about like as a trainee how I sort of handled both of them. So initially I started off as an MD student, and I did a lateral transfer to the MD PhD program. Because of my interest in neurosurgery, sort of geared me to the research aspect, and similar to Dr. Aghi, I just found both of them to complement each other. And when I would do one, I would miss the other one. And so I felt that route was, the best route for me, to become a physician scientist. And after I got into the PhD program, I found ways to sort of engage myself in, going to, whether it's to go to clinics and engage in going to the ORs, and keeping myself, as much as I'm keeping myself, active on the research process, but also keeping myself clinically active. More so to a smaller degree when one portion of the MD PhD was emphasized. So when I was in the PhD, the research was the most important thing, and I would do a little bit of the clinical, more so 10%. And when you go back to the third year, I did try my best to sort of continue reading, keeping updated with what's going on in the lab. That I actually finished my PhD in, as well as like what's the stuff that's going on in the field of some of the things that I had studied. I tried my best to engage in publishing or more articles, although less productive than I had been in the PhD, but trying to again merge both together. And I think that just to ask Dr. Aghi, another question too. Again, there are a lot of people that are conflicted sometimes. Like I'm really interested in research and I really want to do research, but I don't know if I want to do a 4-year PhD, or maybe I just want to do a 1-year or 2-year master's, or just a fellowship. what advice do you have for those people when making those decisions, and what is that pathway for people that you've sort of worked with as colleagues, and that didn't necessarily do an MD PhD but use a different track to become physician scientists today?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that there's numerous examples of incredibly, phenomenally successful physician scientists and surgeon scientists who are pure MDs. And so I think that that pathway is totally appropriate and viable. And I think you can tell early on, even in a one gap year, if it's something that is really lighting the fuse. I would say, I've had probably like almost 15, 16, MD medical students do gap years, and you can tell, even as an observing mentor, which ones have the spark and the foundation to, even though they're just spending a year or maybe 2 years with you, to be able to leverage that into later on into a career as a surgeon scientist. The PhD gives you sort of a basic, a very thorough foundation, and has value for sure, but it's not a requirement by any means.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Devon. I think that's a really important one, and especially for somebody that gets to the end of the MD and doesn't want to go back and do the PhD. Thinking about ways they can still integrate research. So, Dr. Aghi, to shift back, you talked, about when you were first in attending and you were writing the R01. Obviously, we know that grants are a big part of the scientist training pathway, and specifically the neurosurgery scientist pathway. So what do you consider, some of these benchmarks in terms of, training grants and then going to your first full independent grant that people should be looking at as they're going along the neurosurgeon scientist track?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that there's some specific, number of years by which, one should have, an independent grant or things like that. And I've seen a pretty wide range for people who ultimately become successful, some having independent grants within their first year as an attending, and some, taking 5 to 10 years. And you have a long career ahead of you. And so I think, the start is really ultimately just the start. That being said, though, I do think that there is really when you first start as an attending is when you will have the most time on your hands, and success in obtaining initial grants is in some ways a function of some would say shots on goal, but shots on goal is essentially a function of time, because each shot is not like a few hours, it's a few weeks or months or even years. And so I think that was sort of my approach, and that was the advice I got, was that, the longer you're an active neurosurgeon, the more the demands will occur on you clinically or even administratively, which I think coming out of residency, none of us appreciate that aspect of it. But if you hang your hat as a neurosurgeon in an academic department, it's only a matter of time before your calendar is full of Zoom meetings and committee meetings, and it's the unavoidable monster that is part of that circle pie chart of your daily activity. And so for me, that first year or two, it felt like I remember early on, it felt like this is the best it's going to be, and so I kind of devoted a good amount of effort to getting some grant funding secured. And so it wasn't so much that it was a benchmark as it was just this window during which I felt least disrupted. And I think the other thing is, like, having done a lot of grant review, it's fine if you hit year 5 or year 7 without sort of independent grants, but there does need to be something to show for your effort. And so, publications, things like that. So, it needs to be clear to someone who sees you only on a sheet of paper, who's not watching how you spend your day, that you're productive in research, even if you don't have your own funding.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I know I think it's a K-12, grant that's now available for, kind of up and coming neurosurgeon scientists. Obviously that's an opportunity, but what other training grant opportunities do you think aspiring neurosurgeon scientists should be looking for, maybe during residency, and certainly in that transition period?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything during any of the K series, the K-12 is great. The sort of standard scientific one is the K-08.
Right.
I came in on a K-02, which is um, uh, so basically I had drafted a K-08, but I didn't really have a mentor where I had a pre-existing relationship at UCSF. I just, picked
Gotcha.
someone who worked in the same field. And so the NIH, in a very friendly way, came back and told me to convert it to a K-02, which I hadn't even heard of. But a K-02 is basically a grant where you're in training, but you don't have a dedicated mentor whose space you're in. So like I had my own space, and the grant was funded. And then the nice part about it is it's kind of after 3 years, they expect you to get an R01. If you don't, the money disappears. But if you do, for the last 2 years, you get double funded from the K and the R, which is what happened to me. And so that was really helpful. And so I think all of the K series are really good. And then I think just reaching out to the folks at the NIH or even the DoD, which has some grants, and just explaining your situation and getting advice was really helpful for me.
Awesome. Divine, any questions on your end?
Yeah, I was going to ask Dr. Aghi a few more hypothetical questions. Obviously with the match, sometimes you could have, the program that you want to sort of end up at that, has that pathway for, essentially gearing people towards becoming surgeon scientists. And, you could have an applicant that, really wants to go to a program, but ends up matching in a smaller community program that perhaps may not have all the resources and tools there. So what sort of advice do you have for those sort of applicants, to keep engaging in research so they don't really have a hiatus where they sort of have to apply for NIH grants during that time?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I think the first thing is if the person has a solid background during medical school, or before they match, then to some degree that there's the possibility of sort of resuming research after residency in some of those scenarios. But otherwise, some of those programs, like you describe, are willing to support, a trainee spending a year elsewhere to get a tailored experience. So even if the program you've matched at doesn't have the infrastructure to support research time, if they may support you going away, and then you can try for NREF or other funding mechanisms to support something like that. So there are some options, and then there are a number of folks who've pursued pure postdocs at places like the NIH after residency before they start their job. I mean, it's not perhaps the ideal outcome, but it's at least an option if you match at a program that doesn't have a research component to it for residency.
One advice that I've always gotten, especially from some of my mentors that are also MD PhDs, is the importance of aligning your research interests with your clinical interests instead of managing both the MD and the PhD realms. And in some cases, both sort of realms might not be aligned, where you have a different research interest compared to what you have in your clinical interest. Could you talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of both pathways?
I think it's very helpful to have that alignment. There are certainly examples in neurosurgery where that alignment is not really there. I mean, and even myself, it's not perfect. I mean, if you're doing basic biological studies of tumors, I mean, the fact that you're taking out tumors is thematically relevant, but it's definitely not the same as sort of somebody who does neurophysiologic recordings on humans in the OR and then is in their lab interpreting those recordings. That's perhaps the most complete alignment you can get. So I would say it's by no means a requirement to have a perfect alignment, but alignment certainly helps because um, the the overlap can sort of save you some time. It'll look appealing to funding agencies, and it just will make things fit and make more sense. But it's not 100% requirement.
Awesome. I want to turn a little bit to, kind of the mentorship you've had of aspiring neurosurgeon scientists, whether they were MD, PhD students or MD students. And you've, specifically done some work on looking at the research trends among neurosurgery applicants. And I think it was one of the titles kind of described it as an arms race, which we're starting to see. And I think we can only expect it to grow after step one going past now. So, why do you think it is that neurosurgery is so research oriented? And what do you think the value an MD PhD brings to neurosurgery is?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there, historically, just the fact that what we do as neurosurgeons has more open-ended questions or unanswered questions than other parts of the body and other organ systems. That lends itself to being a field where people do research. And then I think the advances in technology and the ability of neurosurgeons to get tissue or record electrical activity in a way that no other specialist or basic scientist can puts us in a very unique position to where research is really important. And then you combine that with the fact that more people want to become neurosurgeons than there are training spots available. It's sort of the perfect recipe for just a litany of applicants who are doing everything in their power to develop a research portfolio that'll look appealing to those programs. I think the MD PhDs are very interesting, and in some ways I enjoy reading those applications for residency from the MD PhDs because, while not that I'm biased towards MD PhDs, but invariably there's just a little bit more brevity to the CV because there's sort of a because the PhD publication in each one is sort of its own individual odyssey, and it's sort of a little bit easier to get through than some of these denser CVs that we see. But I don't know that there's necessarily an advantage or anything. I think MD PhDs are entering into the same pool and dealing with the same stressors. Just having mentored a few of them in terms of the match, it's just as challenging for them to navigate as any other applicant. It's just become really tough.
Yeah, and I think we see that in the match data too, where MD PhDs it's pretty variable in terms of whether or not they're doing the same, better, or worse compared to other applicants, which is kind of interesting. Sorry, Devon, I think I cut you off as you were going.
Oh no, I just had a question for Dr. Aghi with respect to the arms race. I remember when I started med school, which was in 2015, and back then typically the average neurosurgery applicant had about 3 to 4 publications, which was at that point which was a lot. And now during my application cycle, it's about 8 to 9, and so that worries me a little bit because for those that might not have an interest in neurosurgery until they have an elective in the third year, what sort of advice would you have for those individuals in terms of catching up with others that might have an interest, since 11, like myself?
Yeah, that's sort of one of the toughest situations in which to advise. I think it's one of those where even as an interviewer or as somebody reading an application, I just look really carefully because I haven't seen any data to support this, but the person who changes their mind in terms of what they're going to do as a third year, which is, in theory, what third year is all about. But someone like that who comes to neurosurgery late, obviously, as mentors and as program leaders, we're here to advocate for everyone. But I do think those are the applicants where you really do need to spend some time just gauging and being certain that this is their final destination, if you will, and not one more stop before they change again. Because I've seen it go both ways, where somebody becomes like a spectacular applicant even though they came to the field late, and then I've seen someone come to the field late and then a year or two later they've switched to like psychiatry or neurology yet again. And so that's the biggest barrier that those folks face, or challenge that they face. And I think that's more of a barrier in some cases than the fact that they've had less time to like stack up their CV with publications. Because I mean, at the end of the day, if they're bright and they're well trained, you can assume that just because they came late to the field that they should be able to still figure out navigating how to do research. But it's more just making sure that they've really exposed themselves sufficiently to neurosurgery. And so in those cases, I really make sure that they've, shadowed the residents, shadowed the attendings, and done everything that I feel like we need to see for them to be certain.
Yeah, really important question. Maybe related to that, what do you see the role of a research year being for those applicants, and just in general for neurosurgery applicants to kind of, I hate to say build their CV, but to at least grow their experience in a productive way?
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to applicants or students about who are considering a gap year and sort of weighing the pros and cons, and when I list the pros, obviously the cons are delaying earning and time and the cost of living in cities like San Francisco, et cetera. But the pros, I obviously people will say stacking your CV, if you will. But to me, one that gets underrated is just continuing to expose yourself to neurosurgery so that you're certain before you go to the wards, because changing your mind as a fourth year is really doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help you. It doesn't help programs. And, I've had a few people start gap years interested in neurosurgery who end up applying to rad onc or orthopedics. And to me, that's in some ways a more productive use of your research time, because it led to this life-changing decision. So that person's life would have been very different without a gap year, because they would have chosen the wrong specialty. So I think that's another important consideration when you're taking that time, is to just continue to expose yourself to the clinical aspects of neurosurgery and being confident that it's what you want to do.
Yeah, one of my really good books that I read, especially during the MD PhD, candidacy, was the book by Stephen Covey on the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and he talked about being proactive versus reactive in terms of like some of the setbacks, the challenges we face. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about some of the setbacks you had during the surgeon scientist route, and how you sort of were more proactive about handling some of those problems.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one that comes to mind is I mentioned that about 3 years into my K grant, I was up against this deadline by which I sort of had this all or none effect, where if you get an R01, you're like, good to go. And if not, like the money disappears. And I had, during those 3 years, built up a pretty large research group through private foundation grants that I had gotten. But those were sort of winding down, and things were contracting. And I remember feeling this awareness that, times were getting tough, or, that there were some external stressors about funding. And I had contracted the research group. So, in part to sort of out of a need to protect funding for as long as possible. And so it was just 2 people and myself. And I remember, prior to that, we had a larger group of like, 8 or 10 people, and we would have these lab meetings where everybody would be sitting around this long table, and one person would be at the front presenting some PowerPoint, and everybody else would be on their phones, and no one's really paying attention. And you really can't do that when the meeting is 3 people, right? And now it turns into like almost a workshop. And it was really a breath of fresh air because we found, I mean, it'd be silly to have somebody present a PowerPoint of just 3 of us. So we actually ended up doing is like, we were in this room with all these big white boards, and we would like write out ideas, and like all 3 of us, I mean, I was the PI, but I was just joining in this discussion with a grad student and a technician. And we were like, writing out plans and experiments and, troubleshooting things. And we would take pictures of these huge, whiteboards filled with like comments and colored markers at the end of every meeting. And it just like, it reminded me of like the stories you hear about early .com companies and things like that. And there was something really, really precious about that. And I've tried to preserve it even as we've had some subsequent success and the group's gotten bigger, is this spirit of like, no person is too small or too little to share their opinions with the rest of the group. And no person is too large to not hear the opinions of a colleague, and encouraging everyone to like be critically appraising each other's work. And so that was the approach. And I just remember thinking like, yeah, this could be stressful, but at the end of the day, this is what I wanted to do. This is what I signed up for. And it may not work out, but if I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down having fun. I mean, that's what this is. It's fun. And the attitude, I would like to think, actually helped fuel the success. And it's something I always remember. I do remember my mentors being like that. Like, they were cool as a cucumber. You could never tell like what they were worried about or bothered by. And I've tried to preserve that as well.
Yeah, it's some great advice. I think some of the best, lab meetings I've been in, and I'm in a pretty small lab, but it's been those ones where you're, just sitting around with a handful of people and using the chalkboard or the whiteboard. And there's definitely something to that old style, chalk talks that we hear about. Somewhat related to that, you talk about, the managing finances and personnel. Sometimes I look at, my PI, and I wonder if he would be better suited with an MBA than a PhD, for some of these lab responsibilities. How do you go about developing those skills in addition to maintaining your clinical practice and doing good science?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think in terms of finances, there is definitely a degree to which if you're too fiscally prudent, you're never gonna, hit it big. And so you do need, and I think this is probably true in real finances as well, which is, there is a certain level of risk tolerance that's needed to succeed. Because if you only throw your money at sure things, like you're just gonna like make incremental steps. And it's true academically. Obviously, risky projects have a real value. But you want to balance portfolios, so some low-hanging fruit and some risky things. At the same time, though, you always want to check your finances, whether it's equipment or personnel or just and just make sure that that there's not some waste, right? I mean, when you're a PI, like there's nobody doing that for you. I mean, and so I think just reviewing your ledgers thoroughly and making sure that that it's that you've deleted the waste, but and just spread the risk appropriately. Those are some of the things. But I agree, there's a degree to which business management, particularly as your efforts get larger and you're juggling more and more grants, becomes very important.
Definitely. We've talked a lot about academics and clinical and, being successful in that way. Can you tell us a little bit about how you, for lack of a better word, stay sane outside of neurosurgery and research?
Yeah. So I think that's exceedingly important. For me, families front and center. I have two daughters who, and the older they get, the more you literally realize like that there's a very limited amount of time that you have with them, and so I just last month skipped a meeting to go skiing with the family, and I remember seeing everybody posting about the meeting on social media, but I just wasn't fazed, like, because I was doing something more important. And so those choices do need to be made from time to time, and then just focusing in on what the task is at hand. So they may not get a lot of my time, but making sure that when they have your time, it's undivided. And then I'm also a avid runner, distance runner, half marathons, and that's something I chose because I was just drawn to it because I sort of shut my brain down while I'm doing it, and there is a degree of adrenaline rush with the speed and the pace that sort of checks a lot of boxes in terms of just a way to let yourself go, and so I think having something, it doesn't need to be a lot of things, but having something that you can just throw yourself into and forget about everything is very helpful.
Absolutely. John, did you have anything?
No, I was actually going to ask, Dr. Aghi to talk a little bit about the success of UCSF in particular, in their track record of, creating certain scientists. You look at Dr. Stephen McGill coming from UCSF, as well as many others in acquiring R01s. Dr. Englert now with Vanderbilt too. So, what has been that success, the UCSF program in creating folks that end up with aspiring the goal of becoming a surgeon scientist and really finding a way to manage both of them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we're very fortunate to have attendings who, have accomplished that job. And so you get access to a lot of mentors, and you get to see them up close. So then, when you go on to take your first job, sort of some of the pitfalls and how to balance your time, which makes it a lot easier, knowing people who've done it. And then obviously the program itself is selecting for MDs or MD PhDs who have exhibited some potential to succeed in that, so that it's taking the right protoplasm and then throwing them in the right environment, and creates a nice little incubator effect.
Sounds very scientific.
Well, we are, we're starting to butt up to that hour. So I want to get to the last question that we like to ask all our guests, and that's, in reflecting on your life and career in neurosurgery, what advice would you give to your past self, as you were just setting out on the journey into the field?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say, just, can take time to, smell the roses and enjoy the journey. Not that I was grossly deficient in that, but if I would certainly say that it would never hurt to remind my younger self of that, because I don't think I ever look back upon oh, I wish I had taken this opportunity or applied for this grant. I mean, those things come and go. And I'm not really somebody to look back on things with regret or anything like that. But I think, just, I would just remind myself to enjoy every moment, because it goes by fast, and it's a ton of fun, and you should never lose sight of that, because what you're doing is unique, right? I mean, we just got through talking about how many people are just so eager to become neurosurgeons, that when you become a neurosurgeon and a scientist on top of that, you're very privileged and blessed, and just enjoying every moment of that is what I would tell my younger self.
Enjoy the journey and smell the roses. I like that. It's a great way to end. Well, Dr. Aghi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm sure this is going to be, a great resource for MD, PhD students, MD students, anybody, on their journey into neurosurgery and science. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see everybody back next week on the Neurosurgery Journey.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aghi.
Thank you. Take care.